Hello my friends and welcome back to another Baldur's Gate 3 character building guide. Hope you're all doing well. Today I'm covering one of the least discussed and I think most important topics in the game for spellcasters, cantrips. We're doing a cantrips tier list because I think that which cantrips you pick is one of, if not the most important decision that you're going to make when you're building any character with access to cantrips. The reason is that cantrips are with you from the very beginning of the game, and they cost no resources, which means you're going to be using them in combat and out of combat a lot. In fact, the cantrips that you take are often going to be the single most common action that your character takes throughout the entire game, and you will be using them dozens or even hundreds of times over the course of the run. That's why it's a little odd to me that so many builds either get the cantrip selection wrong, skip over it, or have no rationale for why they're taking specific cantrips, something that I try to avoid with my builds, and we're going to be discussing each of the cantrips in detail and why they're good and why they're bad. Before I begin, I will also mention that I got great feedback on my last tier list for feats, and as a result, I am going to make no changes. I think there's some marginal adjustments you could make to the feats tier list, but basically I'm very happy with it and think that everything is pretty much in the right place, so no corrections to be made there. Alright, let's get in and talk about cantrips. First off, let's talk about the categories that we're going to be grouping them into. I've grouped cantrips into 5 categories. In S tier, we have cantrips that you will always take if you have access to them. With very few exceptions, every character that has access to this cantrip will always select it. In A tier, we have strong cantrips that are going to be a great use of a turn when you don't have a leveled spell or something that you want to use, and are in general just very powerful to have throughout the game. They give you significant advantages in certain encounters and are just very valuable overall. In B tier, we have cantrips that are useful. You're never going to be sad to have these, and they're often situationally excellent. Maybe they're not useful in like every single encounter, but when they are, they're really useful. Or just cantrips that are overall pretty solid, but not as powerful as the A tier cantrips. In C tier, we have cantrips that are pretty marginal. They are ones that you can use, and it won't be significantly worse than a better cantrip most of the time, but definitely will be worse, or has very narrow and situational uses. And in D tier, we've got cantrips that are just weak choices most of the time. Either you shouldn't be taking these, or they only have some very narrow uses. I think there are no completely useless cantrips, so I haven't included an F tier, and there's also no cantrips that sort of break the game in an unintentional way, so there's no S+ tier like you've seen in some of my previous tier lists. Alright, let's get in and talk about the cantrips. I'll be judging these based on their strength within the class that has access to them primarily. We will be judging them a little bit against the other cantrips from other classes, but since you'll be usually deciding whether to take them or not based on what cantrips your class actually has access to, it makes the most sense to consider them as alternatives to the other options that class has. So for something like Vicious Mockery, for example, I will be considering it against the other bard cantrips because only bards can take it, and it is you have to decide whether or not to take it based on what bards have access to. So it doesn't make sense to compare it too strongly to all the other cantrips. It's worth mentioning that most characters get access to 3 cantrips at the beginning of the game, and a second and a fourth at level 2, and then 1 more as they level up. Although if you multi-class, you get a lot more cantrips and can afford to take the situational ones more freely if you are multi-classed into 2 casters. To begin with, let's talk about Acid Splash. Acid Splash is the first of the damaging cantrips, and cantrips basically come in 2 types. Either they just do damage, or they provide utility. All the damaging cantrips do a small amount of damage that increases at level 5 and at level 10, and that's your character level 5 and character level 10. So whether you multi-class or not, these cantrips will still improve as you level up. For almost all of the cantrips, this means just adding 1 more die of the damage they do. So Acid Splash deals 1d6 damage at level 1, and then as you level up, it's going to deal 2d6 and then 3d6 damage. That means that the cantrips that have higher base damage dice will improve more as you level up than the cantrips that have lower base damage dice, because it's just doubling and then tripling the damage they do. So if you start with a higher number, it's going to do more damage. Acid Splash is... We also, one other thing I should say, we also, when we're considering the damaging cantrips, have to compare them against the other ones that that class has access to. Usually you aren't going to want to take more than one damaging cantrip. There's a couple situations where you might, but in general, you are going to be best off taking one damaging cantrip and then multiple utility cantrips for most characters, because why take multiple damaging cantrips? You just want the best one that just does the most damage in general. Acid Splash does not do the most damage. It has the cool effect of being the only area of effect cantrip, so it's a 60-foot range dexterity saving throw, which negates the damage. So if the enemy makes a dex save, they take 0 damage. In a 7-foot radius. So you can hit multiple enemies with it. And if you do hit multiple enemies, it's going to be better damage than any other cantrip. However, that's not reliable, and you really want your cantrips to be able to help you finish off weak enemies. That's the primary use for damaging cantrips, or have some other form of utility, which Acid Splash has none. Dex saves is also the worst thing for it to target. Enemies are more likely to pass a dexterity save than they are to have AC you can't hit, typically. It depends on the enemy, but when you're only picking one, you're going to want to take things with the most general use case. And while not that many enemies are immune to acid, it's not a great damage type either. There's not a lot that's vulnerable to it, and it has a few enemies that are immune or resistant to it as well. It, generally speaking, is just going to be worse damage than every other damaging cantrip and has no unique effects. So Acid Splash, right off the bat, I'm going to suggest not taking. We're just going to call it a weak cantrip. It's not 0 usefulness, and if you have Acid Splash on your wizard or sorcerer, you can use it in some situations, but in general, for damaging cantrips, you're just going to be better off with something else. Blade Ward. Blade Ward is the first of the utility cantrips, but it's a utility cantrip that you will typically use in combat. How it works is you cast it on yourself and gain resistance, i.e. take half damage from bludgeoning, piercing, and slashing damage for 2 full turns. So this means you're spending your action, so you basically lose 1 turn, in order to get 2 turns of taking half damage. By itself, this isn't a great trade, because spending 1 turn to take half damage for 2 turns, you break even on the amount of incoming damage, but you had to do that in advance. So you had to spend an earlier turn, and earlier turns in combat are more valuable than later turns in combat, because you're wanting to set up more powerful effect earlier on. An easy way to consider this is, let's say an enemy has 20 health and you do 10 damage. If you attack them once for 10 damage, then they hit you once for, let's say, 10 damage back, and then you attack them again for 10 damage, they die. If you spend your first turn casting Blade Ward, then they hit you for 5 damage, you hit them for 10, they hit you for 5, and then you hit them for 10 again, and they die. Either way, you've taken 10 damage, but in the second case, you've taken 3 turns to do it. So, just in combat, Blade Ward is not an incredibly useful spell. However, it has a couple really cool synergies that actually make it very powerful. Blade Ward does 2 things that are really interesting. One, it allows you to protect temporary HP. So, for example, Armor of Agathis gives you temporary HP, and Blade Ward effectively doubles the amount of temp HP you get. Since Armor of Agathis returns damage as long as it's active, Blade Ward also doubles the amount of damage your Armor of Agathis is going to do. So if you have a build based around Armor of Agathis, Blade Ward effectively doubles that in power level by reducing incoming damage to half. It also combos extremely well with any sources of other damage reduction you have. So if you have, say, a set of armor that reduces incoming damage by 2, and an enemy's hitting you for 10, then that incoming damage is reduced by 20%. With Blade Ward, it's applied first, so the incoming damage is only 5, and 5 minus 2 is a 40% damage reduction. So it doubled the effectiveness of your damage reduction there as well. That set of combos with Blade Ward and how it combines with temporary HP and how it combines with damage reduction mean it's actually a very powerful effect that you can use in certain builds to extremely strong effect. It also has some other corner case uses, like if your character just needs to survive 1 turn for an ally to come help them, like they're in a bad position and don't have anything better to do, you can use Blade Ward to keep them alive. In general, I think Blade Ward is a great pick on pretty much any character that has access to it. It works very well with a lot of other spells and is extremely powerful in with certain combos, as well as having pretty solid utility in bad situations in combat where you just need to live through one turn. I don't think it's an S tier spell because you do need to plan around it a little bit, but Blade Ward is very good, and we're going to put it in A tier. Bone Chill. Bone Chill is another one of the damaging cantrips, and it's a 60-foot range attack that deals 1d8 of damage, so an 8-sided die, for an average of 4.5 damage. This will obviously increase at levels 5 and 10, as well, to 2d8 and then 3d8. Bone Chill also prevents the enemy from healing for 1 round, and there's no save against this effect, so if you hit them with the Bone Chill, which just attacks their AC with a normal attack roll, then they can't heal in any way for 1 round. This turns off potions, regeneration, healing spells, etc. Also, if the target is undead, it gives them disadvantage on all their attacks for the next round, which the more attacks they're making, the more powerful this is. Compare this to Vicious Mockery, which just gives disadvantage on the next attack the enemy makes. Against undeads, Bone Chill can be often preventing them from, or giving them disadvantage on 2 to 4 attacks, depending on how powerful the enemy is. Necrotic damage is an okay damage type, not amazing. A lot of undead that you want to target with this are resistant to necrotic damage, but most human enemies will not resist necrotic damage, and it's just a very good damaging cantrip with a very powerful rider effect. Special mention for use against vampires, which are undead and have regeneration, so this turns off their regeneration and gives them disadvantage on all their attack rolls. So very, very powerful there. I think Bone Chill is one of the best damaging cantrips in the game, and definitely a top tier consideration. Dancing Lights. Dancing Lights lasts 10 turns and requires your concentration, and it lights a 30-foot radius area up. That's a big radius, so that's much bigger than the light from a torch or anything like that. However, it uses your concentration, and it only lasts for 10 turns. So while you can pre-cast it in combat before combat starts, it does get in the way of pre-casting some other things. There's a couple encounters in the game where just having light is very, very useful. But in general, I think you're going to be better off using light. While I don't think Dancing Lights is a bad spell at all, light can just last all day. You can cast it on an ally and just have them shed bright light for the whole day. You can also throw a torch in place of using Dancing Lights or light something on fire, and that will create a lit radius as well. I would say that Dancing Lights is good, and if light didn't exist, I would bump it up a couple tiers, but as is, or at least 1 tier, as is, I'm going to place it in C tier, just because it's outclassed, I think, by the light cantrip, which does basically the same thing, but usually better. And, of course, it competes for your concentration in combat, and concentration is such an important resource. Light doesn't require concentration, so is much better overall. Eldritch Blast. So Eldritch Blast is unique for the damaging cantrips in that rather than getting extra damage dice as it levels up, it gets extra attacks as it levels up. So Eldritch Blast is 1d10 force damage, the same damage as Firebolt, and no rider effect. It doesn't do anything fancy like prevent enemies from healing or anything. But it's one of the best damaging spells even before you consider that it gets extra attacks rather than extra dice. That's really, really good for 2 reasons. One is that it increases the chances of getting critical hits, so if you roll 2d20s, you have more chances of getting critical hits. Actually, it's good for a lot of reasons. I'm just going to go through all of them. 2, it normalizes the distribution of your damage, so it tightens the distribution. Having Firebolt roll 2d... make 1 attack roll for 3d10 damage in the late game means that you either get 3d10 or you get 0. Eldritch Blast has the same average damage, but because it's 3 different attack rolls, you are much more likely to get a result in the middle, which is good because predictability is really important in the game. It's also force damage, which is a damage type that almost nothing resists and also is really good against objects, meaning that you can use Eldritch Blast to lockpick. And finally, having multiple attacks means it applies any rider effects from your cantrips multiple times. Warlocks also get Agonizing Blast that gives them charisma to damage on their Eldritch Blast attacks, and at late levels, when you are making 3 Eldritch Blast attacks, that applies 3 times over. But also any items or anything work with every shot of the Eldritch Blast, not whereas they would only work 1 time with other cantrips. Eldritch Blast is the gold standard for damaging cantrips. Nothing resists it. It will very reliably hit. You can add additional damage to it very easily. It's 60-foot range, incredibly powerful. Generally speaking, Eldritch Blast plus Agonizing Blast is the baseline damage for a damaging character, and you can consider a Warlock with Eldritch Blast as being the standard damage output per turn for a character, with no resources expended. So any character that does worse damage than an Eldritch Blast Warlock should probably be rebuilt, and any character that does better damage is doing really well and contributing more than their fair share of damage to the team. Eldritch Blast is an incredible cantrip. Obviously, every Warlock is going to take it, but also it's the only cantrip that's worth considering, only damaging cantrip that's worth dipping into another class just because it's so good. You can take Warlock to gain access to Eldritch Blast on other casters and increase your damage massively. It's also the only cantrip that's even slightly worth considering taking a feat for, which is a more valuable resource than a 1-level character dip. But Spell Sniper and Magic Initiate can be considered for taking Eldritch Blast. Generally, I'd rather just take a level of Warlock or 2 levels of Warlock so you get Agonizing Blast, but Eldritch Blast is incredible, and every character that has access to it is going to take it. Firebolt. Firebolt is very similar to Eldritch Blast in that it is 1d10 at level 1, 2d10 at level 5, 3d10 at level 10. But it's all made in 1 attack, and it's fire damage, which is a very commonly resisted type of damage. It's the best damaging cantrip for everybody who's not a Warlock in terms of raw damage output. However, this is one that I've recommended a lot in some of my build guides that I've actually come down on a little bit. I think that the rider effects of the other 60-foot range damaging cantrips put them a little bit over Firebolt. It's never going to be a bad pick, and just because it does lots and lots of damage, or it does great damage for a cantrip. You can also light stuff on fire with it, which is not irrelevant at all. But because it doesn't have the utility of Bone Chill, I think in general you're going to want to go with one of the other 60-foot range damaging cantrips. You give up a very small amount of average damage in exchange for a better damage type. Necrotic is generally better to do than fire, and also a bunch of extra utility. So I'm going to put Firebolt in the useful category rather than the strong category, despite what I've sometimes said in previous build guides. Friends. Friends is used in dialogue, and it's used when you make a charisma-based skill check, so persuasion, intimidate, perform, or deception, and it gives you advantage on that roll. However, on tactician difficulty, it will annoy people, or honor difficulty, it will annoy people after you use it. When the friends effect wears off, it counts as breaking the law. So in areas where law breaking is punishable by going to jail, you'll go to jail. In areas where law breaking is punishable by being attacked, you'll be attacked. So it's very dangerous to use this. That being said, there are some really, really important persuasion checks in the game that you are making against enemies that you would fight at the end of the conversation anyways, and having a free way to get advantage on those is super powerful. So for that reason, I'm going to put it up in the useful tier. You're not going to cast it very often, but when you do, it's going to matter a lot. Generally, avoid using this in town. Don't ever use it on companions, because you lose reputation with your companions. Don't use it on merchants, because it'll make things more expensive. But against people that you intend to fight anyways and are making charisma checks against, it's really, really useful. Guidance. Guidance just gives you a D4 on a skill check and can be used either in advance of making the skill check or in reaction to rolling the skill check. It does take concentration, but since it's only used outside of combat, that doesn't, or almost only used outside of combat, that does not really matter. And a D4 is just an extra 2.5 on average to your skill checks, which is basically plus your doubling your proficiency. It's the same as giving you expertise at early levels, and still massively useful throughout the game. Guidance is incredible. Passing skill checks is great. Being able to react to skill checks by passing them is really important. It's also really good to have this on multiple characters, so one can use friends and one can use guidance, and those stack very well together, and so on. Every single character that can take guidance should. It's an incredible cantrip, and probably the single best cantrip in the game. Might actually be the single best spell in the game, in fact. Just massive amounts of value over the course of the run. Light. So I've already talked a little bit about light, but basically you cast this on an ally or an object, and it lights them up in a 25-foot radius, like a bright torch, for the duration of a long rest. That does mean that it will be harder for that person to sneak, so you want to be careful who you're casting it on, but it's still massively useful to light stuff up. There are some encounters in the game where having things lit is really powerful, and it can prevent you from taking disadvantage on attacks in the dark. That doesn't happen that often in this game. Most areas are lit, so you're not going to worry too much about not having dark vision or whatever, but just being able to light an area is very useful. In general, you're not going to cast light that often, and there are a lot of other ways to duplicate this effect, but when you do cast it, it's going to be very good. So, once again, I think that's going to be in the useful tier of cantrip. There's a bunch of encounters, especially in Act 2, where having light is very valuable, although you can duplicate the effect with a weapon that just sheds light by itself, or any item that sheds light by itself, or just holding a torch. Light is a way to do that doesn't cost you something that you're holding, but does cost you a cantrip slot. I think most parties should try to have light somewhere in the party, but if you can't fit it in your build, it's not going to ruin your game or anything, so useful tier I think is a great spot for light to be in. Mage Hand. So Mage Hand is a weird one in Baldur's Gate. It summons an invisible hand, permanently invisible, with 1 HP, that can only do a few things. It can't attack, but it can move around, it can throw stuff, and it can interact with objects. By itself, this is already pretty good. Interacting with objects, like disarming traps and whatever from across the area, throwing things into or out of hazardous locations, so there's a lot of items that might be, let's say, inside a cloud of gas that you want to go pick up with your Mage Hand, and then you can hurl them somewhere else. Useful. That's very good. But Mage Hand also has some really, really powerful, although very irritating to use, in-combat utility. What you can do with Mage Hand, because it can throw items, is you can drop a stack of potions and put the Mage Hand next to them, and then the Mage Hand can throw potions or bombs or whatever at your characters. This is a great way, or at the enemies. This is a great way to heal, and also a great way to apply bombs, alchemist fire, fireworks, etc. to enemies without taking your character's turn. You can cast this in advance of the combat starting, it lasts all day, and you get a massive amount of utility from it. Being able to use potions for free without taking an action is ridiculously strong, and throwing them at whichever ally needs one is very, very powerful. And Mage Hand also does not take up a summon slot or anything. You can have a familiar alongside your Mage Hand, so you can just use this pretty much whenever. Another thing that's kind of weird about it is that because it's a summon with 1 HP and enemies will attack it, they can't normally see it, but enemies with C invisibility, you can use Mage Hand as a distraction. If you cast it next to an enemy with C invisibility, they will often spend their turn hitting it, and spending a cantrip to cost an enemy an entire turn is an incredible trade. So for that reason, Mage Hand also has some weird in-combat utility, specifically against enemies that can see invisibility. You can also actually cheese this by running your pre-summoned Mage Hand up to enemies, and then casting Fairy Fire on them and the Mage Hand, revealing the Mage Hand to enemies that can't normally see invisibility, and causing them to attack it. Just a weird little combo that you can use. I find these combos personally pretty annoying to use, but they are really, really powerful, so we're going to put this in the strong tier. You could even consider putting this in S tier if you are using it for the potion throwing very often, but I think that most players are not going to be doing that in most combats, just because it takes a long time to drop the potions and then throw them and then pick them back up at the end of every combat. But remember that dropping stuff doesn't take an actual action. So while it takes time out of your valuable life here on this earth to do that, it doesn't take time out of your character's turn. Minor Illusion. Minor Illusion can be placed anywhere within 60 feet and doesn't break stealth to cast, and it causes enemies to turn and look at it and walk over to it. This is very powerful out of combat for stealing stuff, because you can just get NPCs and guards and whoever to leave, and then steal stuff and run away before they come back. And also very, very powerful to set up combats. There's two main uses for this. One is to group enemies for AoE effects. And two is to move enemies so that they can't see you, allowing you to set up in a good position to start with a surprise attack. Having enemies all looking in the other direction means you can get into stealth and even make melee stealth attacks very easily with Minor Illusion. And, of course, having enemies group up on the Minor Illusion, they all go, huh, and go look at the cat, and then you drop a fireball on their head, massively multiplies the power of your AoE spells. You can also use it to place them next to hazardous locations. If there's a really difficult fight that you want to use, you can bring enemies next to the edge of a chasm and just shove them into it. It costs you loot, but that's definitely an option. Or just next to a cliff or acid cloud or whatever trap that's on the map already, you can use Minor Illusion to pull them over to that thing. Most enemies are immune to the traps that are in their arenas. They won't trigger them, but you can pull them next to like one of the mines that are in some areas and then detonate the mine with a firebolt from far away, one of the utility uses for Firebolt or flaming arrows or whatever, and then hit them with their own traps. Minor Illusion has millions of creative uses, is very powerful, will often be worth like 100 damage in some encounters. If you can group enemies up for a fireball, it's just going to do massive amounts of damage by itself. It's often worth advantage on your first attack. It's often worth a surprise round. Minor Illusion is just incredible, and every single party should have access to it. You don't need multiples of it. You don't need it on every character who can take it, but if you have a character in your party who can take it, they always should. The first character in your party who can take it always should. Poison Spray. Poison Spray is another damaging cantrip. It's a Constitution save, so that's one of the saves that enemies will most often have a very good save in. And it's poison damage, which enemies are very often immune to or resist, like most undead resist or are immune to poison. Slimes and oozes resist or are immune to poison. Any ethereal enemies resist or are immune to poison, and the list goes on. It's also only 10-foot range. The advantage it has is that it is the highest damage die. It's a D12 compared to Firebolt's D10. So it's going to deal, on average, 6.5 damage compared to Firebolt's 5.5, multiplied as you level up. Poison Spray is bad. 10-foot range is really, really bad. The fact that it does more damage is not useful. In general, you would much rather be able to consistently apply your damage than deal like one more damage on your cantrip attacks. And it won't actually average to more damage, because enemies will very often resist the damage, and it targets the save that enemies are best at in the entire game in Constitution saves. There's very few enemies that have weak Constitution saves, so Poison Spray is just a bad choice for a damaging cantrip. It is one of the only ones that druids get access to, which makes it slightly more interesting for them, but I would still avoid it on druids. You do have better options, although druids get weak damaging cantrips overall. One of those better options is Produce Flame. So Produce Flame is weird. It has a lot of text, but basically you make a fire that you can either hold and it acts as a light spell, or throw and it acts as a firebolt. It's a slightly weaker firebolt and a slightly weaker light spell because it takes a hand to hold onto it, and it does 1d8 damage as opposed to 1d10. But having both in one spell is pretty good. And since these are both useful spells, I think that Produce Flame is actually quite strong. It's not my first pick in general of the A tier cantrips, but it's just a good cantrip. It does two things that already good cantrips do, and while it's slightly worse at both of those things, just having the versatility in a limited cantrip slot is very useful. So I like Produce Flame a lot. Ray of Frost. Ray of Frost is a 60-foot range damaging cantrip, targets AC, and so just like Firebolt, Produce Flame, and Eldritch Blast, etc., it's got the same range, and it does 1d8 damage, just like Bone Chill. It does cold damage, which is, in Baldur's Gate, actually surprisingly one of the least resisted damage types. Some undead resist it, but Baldur's Gate enemies, normally in D&D, cold is a fairly frequently resisted damage type, but just because of the specific makeup of enemies in Baldur's Gate, it's less often. But it does a d8 damage, and it slows the enemy movement speed by 10 feet. Again, there's no save for this, so if you hit with this, it just slows their movement speed by 10 feet. This also compounds if they dash. It's going to slow them by 20 feet if they dash. There's two main uses for Ray of Frost. One is it's a solid damaging cantrip that you can just use anytime. Three main uses, excuse me. Solid damaging cantrip that you can just use anytime for damage. Two, you can kite with it, meaning that you can slow an enemy and then move away from them, and then they won't be able to catch up to you. In combination with anything that increases your movement speed, like Long Strider, being a wood elf, jumping, often enemies, even with a dash, will not be able to get into melee range with you if their movement speed has been reduced by 10 feet. An enemy that moves 30 feet in a round with a 10-foot movement speed reduction gets only 20 feet of movement, or 40 feet if they dash. You can often move 40 feet in one round if you have Long Strider on you. You already have that 40 feet of movement speed. 45 if you're a wood elf. You can usually gain a few extra feet of movement by jumping with your bonus action, meaning you can infinitely stay ahead of enemies as long as you Ray of Frost them every turn. Thirdly, it lets you freeze water. Hitting water with ice will freeze it, creating an ice surface on the ground, and ice surfaces in Baldur's Gate are ludicrously powerful, because enemies that fall prone on an ice surface just end their turn. They also instantly lose concentration on anything they're concentrating on. That means that enemies who have ice surfaces, that putting an ice surface under an enemy often allows you to trade your cantrip for their entire turn. You can also often target the enemy, and if they're standing on water, it will still freeze the water, meaning you can do some damage and cost them their entire turn. Ray of Frost has multiple ways of costing enemies a whole turn and does great damage as you're doing it, so it is just an extremely powerful cantrip. I think it is the other good damaging cantrip alongside Bone Chill. Generally speaking, you're going to want one of these two as your damaging cantrips. Resistance. So Resistance is the cousin of Guidance, but it gives saving throws instead of skill checks. Resistance is worse for that reason, because it still takes concentration, and saving throws are mostly made in combat, whereas skill checks are mostly made out of combat. So when you would want resistance, there's a lot of other stuff competing for your concentration. That being said, if you don't want to spend a spell, pre-buffing with resistance is pretty good. It lasts for 10 turns, and while it does take your concentration, 10 turns of an extra d4 of saves on somebody can come up in certain combats if you don't want to concentrate on something else in that combat. You can also use it in some dialogue checks or story events where you need to make a save during dialogue. Resistance will come up in the same way that Guidance will. It's significantly less frequent than Guidance, and so we're going to put it under useful rather than always take it, but Resistance is still pretty good and one that I like having somewhere in the party. Just generally being able to make your characters better at saving throws is always good, and if you know you're going to make a saving throw in advance, you can precast it, and when a saving throw comes up in dialogue, you can use Resistance to make it more easily. Sacred Flame. So Sacred Flame is only available to clerics, and it is the cleric's version of a damaging cantrip. They get it does 1d8 of damage, just like Bone Chill or Ray of Frost, etc., but it's radiant damage, and instead of being an attack roll, it's a dexterity saving throw for your enemies. Now, a dexterity saving throw is usually slightly worse than an attack roll, but In general, radiant damage is a great damage type. A lot of important enemies are weak to it, and having the option between a saving throw damaging action or just making a crossbow attack targeting the enemy's AC is pretty nice for clerics. I don't think this is mandatory for clerics. It's usually nice to have. It's a decent damaging cantrip that has some uses against certain enemies, but all it does is do damage. It has no utility effects or of any kind, so we're going to put it in the useful tier. But overall, it is, I would say, an okay spell. I think most clerics are going to end up taking this, but you won't miss it that much if you don't take it. Shillelagh, which, as I've mentioned before, is how you pronounce it, or at least as close as I can come without a Gaelic accent. Shillelagh is a weird one, so it's only available to druids, and it transforms a staff or club in your hand into a magical weapon, meaning that you deal 1d8 base damage with it, and it uses your spellcasting modifier for attack rolls. So what that means is that you can make attacks with a melee weapon using your wisdom as a druid. There is also a weird corner case where if you take this spell from Magic Initiate, it will use your spellcasting modifier for the class you took it from. So you can take Shillelagh on a warlock and have a charisma-based club if you want. Somebody pointed that out in the comments of one of my more recent videos, and that's a cool corner case, but not particularly useful to the discussion of Shillelagh. Shillelagh has one marginally powerful use in Baldur's Gate, which is with a torch, which counts as a club, and when you're wielding a torch in your hand as a druid, it's going to actually deal decent damage. Torches deal 1d4 plus 1d4 fire, so making that 1d8 plus 1d4 fire means that your one-handed weapon is actually dealing pretty good damage when you use Shillelagh. It also lets you use your wisdom instead of your strength, so you can dump strength, which you want to do on a druid, of course. That being said, it's pretty much only useful at level 1, because after level 2, if your druid is going into melee, you're just going to wild shape it rather than casting a cantrip and trying to hit things with a club, and it locks you into using a club or staff, of which there are not that many great ones for druids to be carrying in the game anyways. I would say that Shillelagh is marginal. It's not going to be the worst thing to spend your early turns on, but generally speaking, if you want to go into melee with your druid, just turn into a spider and hit stuff. It's much more effective than hitting stuff with your attacks. And if you are stuck in human form and want to make attacks, you probably don't want to be entering melee anyways, because in humanoid form, your druid is going to be pretty squishy. Shillelagh is not the worst thing you can take on your druid, but it's not the strongest thing at all, so I would avoid it most of the time. Shocking Grasp. Shocking Grasp is a melee attack, so it is the lowest range of all of the cantrips, because it's only melee. It's shorter range even than Poison Spray. And does a d8 of electrical damage. Not that many things resist electrical damage, but there are some very important enemies that do. However, it has the effect of removing an enemy reaction when you hit them with Shocking Grasp. What this means is you can attack with Shocking Grasp and then move away from them. It also gains advantage on the attack roll against creatures with metal armor. So you're fairly likely to hit against a lot of melee enemies. That being said, a lot of enemies that should count as having metal armor in Baldur's Gate don't. They just, for whatever reason, are not tagged as it. So a lot of constructs and stuff, you do not get advantage with Shocking Grasp against them. So that kind of coding error is a problem for Shocking Grasp. Generally speaking, the use for Shocking Grasp is to replace a disengage action. So if your character is stuck in melee and you don't want to be in melee, you hit them with a Shocking Grasp and then you can move away, costing them their reaction. You can also use it to disable a counterspell before an enemy that you know has before an important spell. So if you know an enemy has counterspell, then you can hit them with a Shocking Grasp, stop them from using their reaction, and then they won't be able to counter a spell that you really want to land. There's also some reactions that certain bosses get that are very powerful to turn off, so it does have some utility, but the times when it comes up are times where it's kind of a problem, because you don't really want to be in melee with your caster, and if you really want to take a disengage action, then you really, really want it to work, right? Times where you want to spend your turn getting out of melee with somebody, you don't care that much about the marginal amount of damage that you're doing, and you just want to use disengage and get away. For that reason, I'm going to put it in marginal. That being said, the main use of Shocking Grasp is actually from the feat Warcaster, which lets you use Shocking Grasp in place of an opportunity attack. You can do that for some caster-oriented melee characters, like a cleric who's using Spirit Guardians, put them on top of certain enemies and prevent them from moving away, or cost them their reaction if they do move away, allowing you to counterspell or whatever. That, for those characters, it's useful, but it doesn't come from actually picking Shocking Grasp, the spell. I would generally avoid taking Shocking Grasp on most casters. Similarly, the other melee characters that might want it will not have the stats to use it. So like an Eldritch Knight could take Shocking Grasp, but that would be based on their intelligence, so it won't hit that often. You're better off just making a melee attack with an Eldritch Knight. Thaumaturgy. Thaumaturgy is like Friends. It's the medium-sized brother of Friends, in that it also gives you advantage on charisma checks, but only for intimidation and performance. These are the two least used charisma checks, but unlike Friends, it doesn't have any cost. So for whatever reason, casting Friends on somebody is a hostile action, but, blowing out all the candles or making your voice boom like you're at a rock concert isn't a hostile action, even if you do it in the middle of a city. Nobody's going to get mad at you for that one. Given that there are not that many intimidation or performance checks in the game, it's still not as powerful as Friends, or it won't come up as often as Friends, but every time it does come up, it's really, really good to have. For this reason, Cleric 1 to grab Thaumaturgy is a really useful dip on a lot of charisma-based characters, and bards and sorcerers especially can really benefit from taking Cleric 1 and grabbing Thaumaturgy, and then you can intimidate with your Thaumaturgy advantage to very reliably land intimidation checks. I'm going to put it in the useful tier. Similarly to Friends, it is very, very powerful when you can use it, but it doesn't come up that often. But there's lots of ways to make it useful, especially by grabbing it on classes that don't normally get access to it. For a cleric who's not going to be making that many persuasion checks in general, or not going to be making that many performance or intimidation checks in general, Thaumaturgy is not that great, but for characters that will be making it, it's incredible when you need to make those checks. So definitely worth a grab from another class, especially bards, sorcerers, and warlocks. Thorn Whip. Thorn Whip is 60-foot range and deals 1d6 of damage, so one of the weakest damage amounts, but its utility rider is that you can pull an enemy 10 feet closer to you, as long as they're not enormous. Pulling an enemy is very powerful, for the same reason that pushing an enemy with athletics is very powerful, but unlike athletics, this does take your whole action. There's no save against it again. All you have to do is hit with the Thorn Whip, and you can pull the enemy. And one of the things that does make pulling a little better than pushing is that often enemies will start the fight on cliffs above you. You can use Thorn Whip to pull them down off of those cliffs. One thing that restricts that use is that it's only 30-foot range compared to 60-foot. Thorn Whip is very, very powerful when it does do something good, but it will almost never do something that good, I don't think. I'm going to place it in the marginal tier, but with the understanding that that's just because it comes up so rarely that it's going to be powerful, but when it is powerful, it's really, really powerful. Pulling down an enemy down off of a cliff or into an AoE effect that is in between you and them is really good, but just because of the short range, it's pretty hard to effectively use this. That said, I still think it's often one of the best picks for druids, just because their cantrip selection is so weak. So maybe I should bump it up a tier. Yeah, I've actually talked myself into it. I'm going to bump it up a tier to useful, just because cantrips are a sore point for druids anyways. They have weak cantrip selection in general, and when it does come up, it is very good. So we're going to put it there. True Strike. This is the one I know you've all been waiting for, True Strike, and here comes my hot take. True Strike is not useless. Lots of people will say True Strike is going to be completely useless and you should never ever cast it, and that's based on good intentions. So the reason that True Strike is bad is that it just gives you advantage on your next attack. It takes your concentration, which is bad, of course. Lots of things compete for your concentration in combat. While you can cast it on an ally, you will often be like self-casting it or something, and you can usually duplicate its effects just by hiding. However, there is one particular case where True Strike is good, and that is if you can't hide for whatever reason to gain advantage on your attack. Let's say you don't want to start the combat with that character, so they'll be seen as soon as you hit the enemies with a different character, or you are in an arena where you can't get a melee character into combat, you can cast True Strike before the combat starts to gain advantage on your first attack in combat. You would never ever cast True Strike during combat, and the reason is simple, because rolling 2 dice on one attack is always worse than just rolling a second attack. So taking an action to give yourself advantage on your next attack is just worse than rolling 2 attacks. Basically, if you miss with your first attack, then True Strike is the same as another attack would be, right? You're rolling 2 dice, but if you hit with your first attack, True Strike has removed the possibility of getting 2 hits because you spent 1 action on True Strike and 1 action on an attack with advantage versus just hitting twice. Also, of course, that gets even worse at later levels when every action is worth multiple attacks. For the marginal utility of using it before combat, we're going to put it in weak and not in completely useless. I know some people say this is a completely useless spell. It's not completely useless, but it is pretty close. There are times where it will come up, and I wouldn't take it as as a cantrip on most characters, but if you've already got like 2 options for damaging cantrips and all the utility cantrips that you want, True Strike will get cast like once or twice during the game, whereas you might never use Acid Splash on that character that already has Ray of Frost and Bone Chill. So there are times where you would take it over one of these other spells. Generally speaking, though, very bad spell. Vicious Mockery. Vicious Mockery does a d4 of damage, so is actually the weakest of the damaging cantrips, but it is the only damaging cantrip that bards get access to. It also targets a wisdom saving throw, which means there are some enemies that will have very bad wisdom saving throws, like most brutish melee enemies will have very weak wisdom saving throws, and you can reliably land it there. It also does psychic damage, which is not a great damage type. Mindless enemies will always ignore psychic damage, so it doesn't work against like most undead, and so on, or constructs or anything like that, and many of the most dangerous brutish melee enemies that have bad wisdom saves also are just immune to psychic damage. However, it has the rider effect of giving enemies disadvantage on their next attack roll, meaning that they will which is very powerful. It doesn't, unlike Bone Chill, give them disadvantage on a whole turn's worth of attacks, so if they have multiple attacks in a round, it's only disadvantage on the first one. But stopping an enemy from hitting you, especially disadvantage combined with a Lore Bard's Cutting Words, can very reliably prevent an enemy from landing 1 attack if the Vicious Mockery goes off. It's not going to be something that your character is spending a lot of their turns doing, and often a bard is going to be better off just making a crossbow attack, but it's not 0 uses, and I think that it has some utility in some combat engagements. You have to pick your spots with Vicious Mockery. Lots of bards are going to take it, but in general, it's weaker than just using a crossbow or using a scroll, something like that. If you are just looking to deal damage and win the fight as soon as possible. Against some particularly strong enemies with weak wisdom saves, it can be useful to stop a single attack with it. So I'm going to put it in the marginal tier. I think if you were comparing it theoretically to Acid Splash or whatever, it's better than that because it does have some pretty good utility, but just the very weak damage on it means it's often not a great use of your turn. So for action economy reasons, it goes in marginal. All right, my friends, here is the final look at all of the cantrips. One thing that you'll notice here is I think cantrips are actually quite well balanced in Baldur's Gate and in Dungeons and Dragons. There's not an most of them are in B tier, which is what you want. You really want this kind of bell curve distribution when you're doing game balance. You'll notice as well that a lot of the weaker ones are damaging cantrips, and that's just because when you're picking a damaging cantrip, you just want the best ones. The others are usually superseded by better options. I hope that you enjoyed this video, and as always, of course, feel free to let me know what you think, if you'd move anything around. Leave a comment, like the video, and you can subscribe to my channel for more of this and other strategy game content, and let me know if a spells tier list for higher level spells is something that you're interested in. Cheers, my friends. Catch you next time.